this is Leo, and I would like to welcome you to the first tutorial by Pitch Roll Yaw. This is Kerbal Space Program version 0.21.0 point something. That's just a build number, not really important. But the important thing is that if you have an older version of KSP, I would recommend upgrading to 0.21 because this tutorial is for 0.21. So, today I'm going to be talking to all the newbie designers out there or people who just need a few tips. So from that main screen, to get into the actual game, you just need to hit Start Game. From there you get this menu, the Start Game menu, which has this excellent little moon vehicle here. You can press Resume Save to open a save game, which I have none of right now, or you can start a new game. From the Start a New Game menu, you can name the game, which I'm going to be calling this PRY Basic. I don't know why that's all caps, but whatever. You can also choose a mission flag. In this case, I'm going to choose the Kerbal Mun flag because I like it the best out of all the ones that are available. So you hit start, and after a brief loading period and a massive frame rate drop for my recorder, you will get to this. Basically, it's a menu. From here, you can go to the tracking station, which allows you to track all your currently launched vessels, of which we have none. You can go to the launch pad, which if you have an already built vehicle, you can simply launch it from there. You can go to the runway, which is kind of hard to click on, but allows you to launch vehicles built in the spaceplane hangar. You can go to the spaceplane hangar to build vehicles, or you can go to the vehicle assembly building to build vehicles. There's also this new building called the Astronaut Complex, which, as of right now, is basically pointless, but in the next update, career mode is going to be added, and it's going to be the center of a lot of your activity. For right now, we're just going to use the vehicle assembly building because the spaceplane hangar is basically for more advanced craft that do not launch straight up, but instead act like planes, or are rovers that rove around on the surface of Kerbal, which is this planet, by the way. Everything basically in this game has a K in front of it. You know, Kerbal, everything, whatever. For example, instead of the solar system, it's called the Kerbaler system, and well, basically everything is real-world names modified a little bit. So we're going to be starting in the vehicle assembly building. When you load up the vehicle assembly building, this is what you're going to see. Now, in this save, I have very few mods installed. The only mods that I have are the MechJeb mod because, as you may have noticed, this is a tutorial for designers rather than pilots, so I'm going to be showing you how to build ships and then use MechJeb to fly them rather than manually flying them. I will show you the basics of manual flight just in case MechJeb is acting up, which is unfortunately common. Also, I have the ISA maps app plugged in just to give us something to do later on in these tutorials. I may never use it, but it's there if we need a mission. So, to begin your spacecraft, you need to select a base part. Usually, you should choose one of these command pods. For this demonstration, I'm just going to bring a Kerbal to orbit and show you some basic orbital maneuvers with MechJeb, and then land. So, we're going to choose the basic command pod Mark 1 because it's a very cheap, cheap in weight. The actual dollar value of parts is essentially pointless in this game as of right now because there is no career mode. But weight directly affects the range of your vehicle and the delta V required, or the fuel required to give it the amount of delta V that you need, which I'll explain the concept of delta V in a moment. But basically, this is going to contain one Kerbal, and we can look here, and it's called the Command Pod Mark 1. It requires one crew to operate, and in fact can carry only one. It is so-called SAS equipped, which means that it has a sort of very, very basic autopilot already built in. Contains reaction wheels, which means it can turn itself without any extra parts, although it's not very strong. And it requires a small amount of electric charge for it to run. It also can store a small amount of electric charge, and it weighs in total 0.8 tons. There's also various other useful information on this panel, and some useless information, which is usually funny, in the description. So, for a basic vehicle, this pod here is all that needs to re-enter. So, to separate it from what will be the rest of the structure, we can go into the Structural tab, and go to the next page and get what's called a stack decoupler. What these do is that they have explosive bolts built in. They will fire the bolts and separate the pod from whatever is below it, or any parts above from any parts below. We'll use more than one of these in this design, although they will most likely be different specific ones from this. Now you can see in this pane, it tells you the decoupler force. Basically, for larger things, you need more powerful decouplers. I could be using this decoupler, which has the same force but doesn't have the same tolerances. It's less strong and just generally worse. For the upper stage, we're going to place a small fuel tank, which contains, as you can see here, 90 liquid fuel, 110 units of oxidizer, and weighs just over a ton. Now, liquid fuel and oxidizer combine to allow rockets to fire, and basically you only have to worry about liquid fuel because the oxidizer is automatically balanced for you in the parts pre-made for the game, and in any well-made mod parts. Now we get to look at engines. These are the basic engines of the game. The Skipper engine is the most recently added, and it is a fairly large engine, and as it says, can be used as a mid-stage booster. We're going to look at it to demonstrate the basics of engine statistics in this game. On this engine, the engine max power is 650, which basically means it could lift 649 tons off the ground. If your rocket weighs 650 tons, it will just hover. Then there's the basic jet engine, which is a special type of engine. It is highly efficient, but can only run when there is air present. It doesn't use oxidizer, but requires it to be in an atmosphere. And using jet engines is pretty advanced, and I'll probably cover that in another tutorial. But if you look at the specific impulse rating, which is noted as ISP, you can see that this has an ISP of 300 to 350, and this has an ISP of 2,000 to 1,000. Now, ISP is a measure of efficiency, so the higher the ISP, the more efficient the engine. Obviously, this Skipper is significantly less efficient than this jet engine. The Skipper is still less efficient than any of the other rocket engines on here, with the exception of the mainsail. Basically, the higher thrust a rocket engine is, the lower the efficiency is going to be. Why? Well, in the real world, it's because of the way that propellant works. But in the game, it's basically a matter of balance. Because otherwise, you would just always use the largest engine. There would be no reason to use smaller ones. And since this game is trying to be as realistic as possible, they try to make, well, that's not really true, as you'll see later, but it is trying to be fairly realistic, so they try, in general, to make the specific impulse pretty close to real-world engine-specific impulse. Now, for this stage, which as I said is the Deorbit stage, meaning that once we're in orbit, we're going to use this stage to come down, we need a fairly efficient engine, but it doesn't need a lot of thrust because this upper stage doesn't weigh a whole lot. So we're going to take this LV909 engine, which you can see only has 50 power. But since we're in orbit, there's no really time limit on how long our burn can be, which usually there will be, especially when launching or doing complex transfers. But when you're just trying to deorbit, it doesn't really matter. So we can use a small engine with a high specific impulse. And this engine has the advantage of being light. So as a payload engine, it's perfect because it won't be too hard to drag up into orbit. So now that we have this stage, you can see that on the side, this decoupler has been added and this engine. This is pretty much the correct order we want them to fire in because the things on the bottom fire first. So the engine is going to fire, then when it's done burning or when we decide we're done with it, we can hit space, and this decoupler will fire, which will separate this section from the bottom section. So that's basically what we want. Sometimes you'll have to adjust the staging manually. Okay, we're now done with this stage, at least for the moment. So I'm going to go into Structural, find a decoupler, and place it on the bottom of the stage. You'll notice that a fairing, that's what this is called, this little metal piece, automatically appears around the engine to protect it from atmospheric effects and make it look better, basically. Now, for the what's called secondary ascent stage. This is the part that once the rocket is fairly high up in the atmosphere, pushes it the rest of the way into space and circularizes the orbit. This doesn't need to be particularly large either. It's just a small, tiny, really, fuel tank. But I don't know exactly how much fuel we'll need. So I'm going to use what's called MechJeb, which is a plugin that you can download. I will place a link in the description. And I highly recommend using it. Once you place this part on the vehicle, this little tab appears on the side. You can click on it and then click Delta V Stats. Now, Delta V is basically a measure of how much your spacecraft can change its speed, and that is everything in spaceflight, as I will show you. To escape Kerbin's atmosphere and get into a stable orbit requires around 4,500 meters per second of delta V. Now you can see in this second stage, because we have a highly efficient engine and it weighs so little, you can see stage 1, the thrust-weight ratio on the surface would be 2.6, or 2.06, I'm sorry, which means that we provide 2 times as much thrust as we have the weight of this stage. In the atmosphere, this engine would produce 1,500 meters per second of delta V, but in space, because all rocket engines are more efficient in space, it produces almost 2,000 meters per second of delta V, far more than enough to deorbit and land. Well, re-enter anyway. This is great because it means that even with this simple design, I'll get to show you some basic orbital maneuvers. Okay, now for this stage. This stage here. I'm going to try putting various engines on just to see what the thrust-weight ratio will be and what the delta V will be and how much more we'll need. For this LVT-30, which I'll place on the bottom now, it has a thrust-weight ratio, I hate saying that, a TWR of 3.64, which is way more than you need. So I'm going to remove that engine and place something smaller and a little more efficient, such as the LVT-45, which has 15 tons less thrust but is significantly more efficient. This only gives us 1.3 kilometers per second, or 1,300 meters per second, of delta V, even in vacuum. And remember that since this is supposed to push the craft into space, it will be burning at least partially in the atmosphere, so that's not really great. So I'm going to I'm going to replace this fuel tank with something a little larger. The FLT-800 fuel tank, also known as the stretch tank, which will provide us with a lower thrust-weight ratio, obviously, because it weighs more, but 2,200, in fact almost 2,300 meters per second of delta V in vacuum, and even a decent amount purely in atmosphere. This will definitely be enough to get us the last bit and to circularize the orbit. Now, for the final stage, or really the first stage, but, you know. Under Structural, I'm going to add another decoupler and get a... Oh, now I'm lost. Right, this happens sometimes. These menus can be a little confusing, but you'll get used to it eventually. Okay, I'm going to place another stretch fuel tank here and grab this LVT-30, a fairly powerful engine. Now, even just with this engine, we have a 1.53 thrust-weight ratio. This means that it could lift the rocket at a pretty decent rate, but it doesn't really have enough delta V to go much of anywhere. I mean, it could get pretty high, but I prefer to have higher delta V than that, especially since this may not be enough to reach orbit with this payload remaining unaffected. So, I'm going to add something very helpful, radial solid rocket boosters. Now, radial basically means that they're, instead of being attached to the bottom, which is called stacked, they're attached to the side. And to do that, you pick one of these 3 radial decouplers. They're just like the stack decouplers in that they blow things off the rocket in a fairly controlled way, but instead they attach to the side. Now there's this small one, a large one, and a small one that's pushed out from the side. This is very helpful for larger things, but we don't really need that here. I'm just going to use this TT38K radial decoupler. By the way, you don't really need to learn these numbers. It's helpful. Actually, no, it's not really helpful at all. I'm just saying them because they sound cool, and they're there. But basically, this is the small decoupler, this hydraulic detachment manifold, that's the big decoupler, and this is the sticking out decoupler. You don't need to know the numbers. Okay, now, one nice feature of this game is that you can see here, symmetry mode will automatically make things symmetrical. So it starts with this little dot, which is no symmetry, right? This would just be the only one of these. If you hit X, it will switch to 2 times symmetry, which you can see, just by placing 1, it has actually placed 2 in perfect symmetry. And it places them together in this staging menu. Clicking it again, and pressing X again, we can switch to 3-fold, 4-fold, 6-fold, or even 8-fold symmetry. There are mods that increase the symmetry even further. For now, though, I think we'll only need, at most, 4-fold symmetry, so I'll set it on that. Now, under propulsion, you have 2 choices for solid rocket boosters. The small solid rocket booster, which has a decent power, relatively alright specific impulse, especially for a solid booster, and will get your rocket up to a pretty high speed. Then there's the large solid rocket booster, which has, surprisingly, slightly better specific impulse and much higher thrust. So basically, you should go with this if you have a rocket large enough to accommodate it. So here we go with 4 solid rocket boosters. Now, these solids by themselves will provide a good 1,900 meters per second of delta V in vacuum, or 1,800 in atmosphere. So with all these, with the solids, this liquid, and this liquid, it should get this payload into orbit. So, one last thing, it's a good idea to place nose cones on top of these solids. And the game is refusing to cooperate with me. There you go. That happens occasionally. Just keep trying to place the thing, and it will allow you to place it. And now this looks pretty decent. So I'm going to add a stabilizer. These Delta Deluxe winglets are excellent stabilizers because they provide some basic ability to control the rocket while still allowing it to remain relatively stable and not waving around too much and looking dumb, basically. I'm also going to add some to this upper stage, which will at least partially be burning in the atmosphere. Now, something else. We don't really need this, but I would like to demonstrate the concept to you. So to help us control this upper stage, which won't be in atmosphere and so can't really use wings with ailerons to control it, we're going to get what's called an inline reaction wheel. This is basically all it does is it allows the rocket to turn without having to use RCS, which basically RCS is something that uses very, very tiny rockets to turn the spacecraft and should only be used when you need to dock things because it requires you to carry very heavy propellant. Now, one final thing. How's this Kerbal going to get home? We have to put a parachute on the top, or else our Kerbal is going to be extremely flat or, exploded when he hits the ground. So there's that. Now our rocket is built. Now, once you've built the rocket, check the staging. So solids fire first, then they separate, and this engine fires. But these two are in different stages, which means there will be a small coast period while it loads the next stage. So it's better to put them in the same stage, at least for in-atmosphere maneuvers. This will let you immediately stage off these boosters and then fire the engine. Okay, Then this will separate and this engine will fire. Again, these should probably be in the same stage, so that as soon as this area separates, this engine will start burning, right? So then once this is done, this will separate. For high upper stages, it's probably a good idea not to start the burn immediately, because you might accidentally leave the throttle up and screw up your trajectory. So we're going to have these in 2 different stages. Also, we need to take this parachute out of this separation stage, because otherwise it will deploy too high up. There. Now the staging is ready. We need to add 2 more things. All rockets need power to maneuver, and since I don't have any batteries on this because it's not really going very far, and probably won't be out of the sun, I'm just going to add some solar panels. These are great to add because they don't require you to extend them. They don't provide a whole lot of power, but they will provide easily enough to maintain running MechJeb, which requires power, and this capsule. Also note that all engines produce power, but they do need power to ignite them, so if you're at 0 power, having a liquid engine won't really help you get more. So you should always include some method of generating power, be it these solar panels or other methods that I will demonstrate in other tutorials. The other thing that we need to add is under structural, it's these launch stability enhancers. While technically you can launch without these, it's a better idea to use them, because they basically hold the rocket up off the ground and prevent the various glitches that are present in the game from destroying your rocket before you can even get a chance to launch it. So, we also need to make sure that these aren't firing before the engines, because otherwise the rocket will just fall. Some people prefer to have them fire after, but I find that to be generally a waste of propellant. In real life, obviously you're going to need to do that because engines take a lot of time to throttle up, but that's not really the case in this game. Now, the final thing to do is to give the spacecraft a name. Let's call it Freedom 7, which, if you don't get the reference, the first ever United States rocket into space with a human on board was called Freedom 7. So, you know, following the great tradition of Kerbalizing everything, we're going to call it Freedom 7. Okay, this is a little high up off the ground, and it makes for a more epic launch if you lower it. Holding Shift and clicking on any part of the rocket will allow you to move the entire rocket around. I'm going to line this up with the ground, and we're ready to launch. Okay, now that this is loaded, I'm going to show you the parts of the MechJeb system while you're in flight. It has all these different windows down here on the side, which I'll demonstrate each in turn, not in this video probably. But for right now, all you need to know about is the smart-ass maneuvering system, which lets you do basic things, which I will show you how they work in orbit, and the Ascent guidance system, which you can enter an orbit altitude. The lowest stable orbit is 70 kilometers, but I find it to be rather inaccurate, so we'll punch it at 75 kilometers. Orbit inclination, which means how much rotated away from the equator the orbit is. Right now we'll leave it at 0. It takes a lot more engine power to get into an inclined orbit. Prevent overheats should always be on so that your engines don't overheat. And limit to terminal velocity is helpful, because if you go past terminal velocity, air resistance really starts making you waste propellant, because you have to push through all that air. You can also limit the acceleration if you're actually worried about hurting the Kerbals. I'm not, because it's not actually built into the game. Leave corrective steering on, or else it won't actually help you really at all. And I would recommend not using auto stage. Auto warp is nice because it lets you not have to wait a long period of time between when the engine shuts off from the ascent burn and when it turns on for the circularization burn in orbit, which you'll understand what that is in a moment. Okay, looks like we're ready to go. So I'm going to hit Engage Autopilot and show Ascent Path Guidance. Now this little purple marker will show us where the rocket should be pointed. If it's not pointed there, we need to do something about it. Okay, let's go. Okay, so I've hit space and we've staged, and our solids are now bringing us upward through the atmosphere. You can see their delta V is dropping here because they're using up propellant, and the thrust-weight ratio is actually going up because they weigh less now because the propellant's being burned, and propellant does have mass in this game. Here you can see the fuel indicators that are built into the game. Once these reach 0, these will shut down, and they're a helpful way if you don't have MechJeb enabled, which some purists feel that it's quote-unquote cheating to use it. I personally like it a lot because it lets me focus more on building the perfect rocket than trying to fly it perfectly. Okay, now we've started our gravity turn, which basically what this does is gives us more velocity as we go upward. The solid rocket boosters ran out of fuel, so I jettisoned them, and MechJeb has lit up our liquid Ascent engine, and now you can see that the liquid fuel indicator is on. Liquid fuel engines can be throttled, unlike solid fuel engines, which is helpful because now MechJeb can actually use its ability to limit us to terminal velocity. With this engine, it's not really an issue because the thrust-weight ratio right now is so very low, but with the next stage, it may become a problem. One thing you'll notice is that we're already going quite fast, 400 meters per second. If you're not going about 200 meters per second by the time that you reach 10 kilometers on this altitude meter, you're going to have a problem with your rocket. Unless you have insane amounts of fuel, it's probably not going to make it to orbit. But in this case, we should be good to go. So now all we have to do is wait for this to burn out. Right-clicking on the engine, by the way, gives you all kinds of useful information about it, which I'll go through later. Okay, we have engine shutdown, and I fired the next stage. Always looks cool to watch that stage drift away. By the way, pressing F2 will shut off the heads-up display. If you're on autopilot, this is always fun because you can just watch the scenery. Now, this engine's going to burn for a lot longer. Why? Well, primarily, it's because it's already more efficient, and we're farther up in the atmosphere to the extent that it is at its maximum specific impulse already. You can see 370.0 specific impulses in seconds. It's as efficient as it gets for this particular engine. Up here is the atmosphere gauge, which is a very helpful indicator of where we are with regards to pressure and thus specific impulse for our rockets. Okay, now this is throttling down, and MechJeb is just adjusting our apoapsis. And now we're coasting to the edge of the atmosphere, getting ready for the circularization burn. For right now, I'm going to show you the map. This map is a map right now just of Kerbin, but you can zoom out to see the whole Kerbaler system. This marker, well, this blue line indicates our flight path. This marker indicates our apoapsis. Apoapsis is the point farthest away from the surface of the planet you're on. MechJeb has now plotted us a circularization orbit, and you can see that we're going to perform this burn right here, which will bring us into this orbit indicated by the orange line. The burn takes this much delta V, 617.2 meters per second, and as the engine lights, you can see it reducing, and this burn should be over pretty quickly. This tells you how long the computer thinks the burn will be and when the node is. T plus means it already happened, so we should be over halfway done with the burn, which we are. Okay, now for the last 5 meters per second, it does fine-tuning with the engine at almost 0%, and you can see the little indicator sort of dancing around for fine-tuning. Now we're done, and if we look on the map, we're in a almost perfectly circular orbit, 75.1 kilometers apoapsis, highest point, and 74.8 kilometers periapsis, lowest point. Now, the best place to do maneuvers is at periapsis. Why? Well, this guy named Oberth came up with a thing called the Oberth Effect, which he discovered basically means that when your ship is going faster, it's easier to get even faster. So I'm going to stage away this bottom portion. You can see that even without burning away from that, the decoupler is fairly strong. And now we're left with just this small capsule. I'm going to start up this engine, but not actually fire it, and open another useful tool called the Maneuver Node Editor. Oh, sorry, the Maneuver Planner, rather. The Maneuver Node Editor is also helpful, but it's a little more advanced. In the Maneuver Planner, you can choose what kind of node you want to do. We don't need to circularize because our orbit's already circular. I'm just going to show you changing the periapsis. So right now, our periapsis is basically 75 kilometers. If I want to make our orbit higher, I have to first change the apoapsis, so let's say 100 meters. Then we can choose when to change it, let's say at the next periapsis, because that's the most efficient. And you can press Create and Execute, and it will automatically create for you the node. You can see it has done that here. And it will warp around the orbit with this time warp acceleration, which really does nothing but skip frames such that time seems to go faster, so we don't have to wait the whole 90 minutes for this orbit to go until we get to that point, and then it will execute the burn for us. See the beautiful Kerbal scenery here coming into the sun. Okay, now that we're coming around, we're going to get ready to execute this burn. It does a final rotation correction before we get to the actual burn point. You should always make sure that your engine is actually set up to light before it tries to do the burn, because otherwise you'll miss the burn point and you'll fail. Okay, now because it's such a small burn, it only needs to burn for under a second or so. Then this little fine-tuning, and now our apoapsis, as you can see, lines up with the maneuver node at approximately 100 kilometers. So now we can change the periapsis to 100 kilometers, or we can just circularize at next apoapsis and execute. That's another 20 meters per second, and we can wait for it to go around. As it does this, you may want to check this resources pane up here, which tells you how much of every resource you have left. Our electric charge, as you can see, is slowly draining, but when we come into the sun, it will begin to recharge because of the solar panels. As you can see, there's dawn, and boom, recharged. So, we're ready for this burn. Node in T-minus 3, 2, 1, and firing. And there goes the burn. And if we look at our orbit on the map, we are circularized. In fact, we're circularized so well, the computer can't really decide where our apoapsis and periapsis are. Well, now we're going to I'll show you the different various parts of smartass. So we should stay in orbit mode for right now because the other modes are for very specific things. Prograde means the direction forwards along your orbit. Burning this way will increase your velocity and raise your orbit. Retrograde means the direction backwards along your orbit, and burning this way will decrease your velocity and thus shrink your orbit. The normals are this way and this way, as you can see, and these allow you to change the inclination of your orbit. Radial positive and radial negative are forwards, towards, and away from the surface of the body you're orbiting, basically, and they're essentially only for more advanced maneuvers. You really don't want to come down. You would think that to come down from orbit you would burn like this, but actually that's probably the most inefficient way to do it, except in certain situations. Well, now Jebediah Kerman, our brave pilot, has done his science, so we're going to go for a short EVA by pressing the EVA button, and he exits the spacecraft in an incredibly unrealistic amount of time. We can use the WASD keys to walk around on the ladder. If we press F, we can board again, or we can press space to let go. As you can see, we've now let go of the spacecraft, but we have no way to maneuver. Pressing R will enable his jetpack, and we can fly around on his little jetpack. Fly away, whee! And come back. Right-clicking on him will let you see the amount of fuel he has left. These jetpacks are actually somewhat overpowered. Whoa. Okay, as you can see, I'm kind of terrible at flying them. Basically, you should get good at this. I haven't. Okay, let's come in for a pass here and hit F to grab, F to board, and we're back on board. Well, now we want to go home. So, this I'm going to do manually. So let's shut down all the other parts of NecJeb. As you can see, we still have a kind of ridiculous amount of delta V left. We really don't need that much for this. I could have used a much smaller fuel tank. Okay, we'll point the spacecraft retrograde with the assistance of our reaction wheels. And we will start to burn the engine. if we look at the map, you can see that our periapsis is steadily going down, down, and now we are on what's called a suborbital trajectory, where our orbit actually re-enters. Now, I want to execute a splashdown rather than a crashdown because I don't know, I just like to. There's no real reason. Our parachutes are plenty strong enough to let us survive a crashdown, but I prefer not to do it that way. Now that our orbit intersects the ocean, we can hit X to immediately shut down the engine. And then we will fire this decoupler with space. And since MechJeb is on our command pod, we can simply leave it and keep aligned retrograde. Now, if you see this parachute hasn't actually been deployed yet, I prefer to wait until we are through with reentry to deploy it because it's more realistic. That's not actually necessary, but you can if you like. Okay, now by clicking up here, we can start time acceleration. Which will bring us into the atmosphere. But you can't use that kind of time acceleration when you're in the atmosphere because there's always physical effects going on. So it switches to what's called physical time acceleration, which only lets you go up to 4 times. What I was at with the other acceleration was 50 times. As you can see, it's a little glitchy because it's running at 4 times normal speed, but still simulating all the physics. And you can see we're coming in at quite a velocity. 1.9 kilometers per second. That's pretty fast. Think about it. It's 19, almost 20 football fields every second, so a little ridiculous. But soon we should be able to see re-entry effect. If I speed this up. Yeah, there we go. The beautiful Kerbal Space Program re-entry effects. And if you look on the map, our orbit is actually shrinking. Well, our trajectory is actually shrinking even more. So we're really going to land in the middle of nowhere. So here we are coming in, and you can see it heating up to a nice glow. In the actual game, this really does nothing, but there are various mods, most specifically the Deadly Reentry mod, which actually add a consequence to improperly reentering. The consequence being you die, and you would need a heat shield for that. Luckily, this is a basically unmodded version. Okay, now we're at 10 kilometers, so I'm going to blow the parachute by pressing space. And you can see the parachute is set up here. And now that we have a parachute, we don't really need smartass on, so I'm going to turn that off and entirely shut down MechJeb. And as you can see, once you close all the windows, and as long as nothing's on, MechJeb's status will change to the red indicator light, which means it's not being used. That red indicator light also comes on if it has no power. Okay, we're coming down, and this is incredibly boring, so basically I'm just going to accelerate it up to 4 times. But you can see that the parachute does not fully deploy, and we're still going at quite a clip, an unsafe speed in fact, until we get to about 500 meters, when the parachute finally fully deploys and we slow down to about 6 meters a second. For larger craft, though, you're going to need bigger parachutes to slow down to a safe speed. Also, be careful that if you have all your parachutes attached to the top part, and you're going quickly, the bottom part might separate without chutes and crash down by itself. Okay, well, now we're landed in the ocean, so we can hit escape and go back to the Space Center. Now, to recover a flight without injuring the Kerbals in it, you need to go to the tracking center, and we can now see all our flights. The only thing right now is Freedom 7. We have the option to fly it, go back to fly it. We could hit this, which would abort it, killing everyone on board, but we can't do that now because we have the option to recover it, which brings the Kerbals back and marks it as a successful mission. So we'll do that. Recover. Now we have no active flights because we've recovered Freedom 7, and we're done with this tutorial. So now that it is twilight at the Kerbal Space Center, I'm going to have to say goodnight. This is Leo for Petrol Yaw, signing off.